Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Maureen Olevnik, Coordinator of Global Food Systems.
I'm Scott Denona. I'm a philosopher of science.
And I'm John Fabian. I'm a food scientist.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Kansas State University Global Food Systems podcast, Something to Chew On. In today's podcast, we will visit with Dr. Marcellus Caldas, a self-described economic environmental geographer. Some of Dr. Caldas's past research included the study of the cocoa economy and effects of that economy on the Atlantic rainforest of Brazil. This work evaluated the attitudes of cocoa farmers and implications on the environment. Dr. Caldas's research focus remains on the analysis of land use and land cover change, environmental processes, spatial patterns, and its effect on policies and governance at different scales. Dr. Caldas is a professor of geography and geospatial science. Marcellus carries PhDs in applied economics from the College of Agriculture at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and in geography from Michigan State University.
Welcome, Marcellus. And thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. We're looking forward to learning a lot more about your background and about the work that you do in the food-related area. But before we get started down that path, could you give us a little background on yourself and how you got interested and moving into this kind of activity?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I think my story is not so different from many people that work with the environment. I was a small boy in the Amazon. So I was born in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon. And I was a Boy Scout. I had a trip in the summer of 1968 or 69. So the idea of the trip was to go and learn about the Trans-Amazon Highway. The Trans-Amazon Highway was a federal road that the Brazilian government was building, crossing the Amazon from east to west. The idea was to bring people without land and connect with land without people. So in that trip, I had a chance to see, what was the Amazon, going outside the big city and see the jungle and see the population that are living there and so on. So in that trip, instead of seeing the development that the government was proposing, as a young boy, what I saw was a bunch of destruction, big trees, erosion, Native Americans, pushing out of their lands and so on. So that was very touching for me, seeing that type of thing. It wasn't what I was expecting to see. I was expecting to see wildlife, and I saw about that. And when I went to college, I decided to become an environmentalist, but not the sense, but in the sense of to study. I'm an economist by background. I have a PhD in applied economics by the College of Agriculture at the University of Sao Paulo, and I have a PhD in geography, where I work with GIS, remote sensing. And my idea was to learn how to propose policy, conservation policy. That's what I do. I work with land use, land cover change. I do environmental studies and trying to influentiate policymakers. That's basically, some of my background.
As I was reading through your background, you mentioned that working in the Amazon, you had done work on cocoa plantations or cocoa growing activities in that area. Can you expand a little on what that was about?
Yeah, one of the things that we had done, in fact, it wasn't the Amazon, it was the Atlantic forest. It was when I was a professor in the College of Agriculture in one of the universities in Brazil. We had a grant from Conservation International to look at the farmland use decision of the cocoa farmers. The Atlantic forest is one of the most degraded forests in the world. Probably Brazil has now just 4% of that forest. The rest was completely logged in the forest for urbanization and agriculture and so on. But the cocoa plantation is very interesting because they have a production system where they use the shades of the big trees, to protect the trees, the cocoa trees. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that Brazil was one of the biggest producers, probably number one in terms of cocoa. And the state of Bahia, the place that I was working, it was the number one of the country. And cocoa is like any other commodity that are boom and bust, and we're going through a very good boom. However, in 1986, 87, the cocoa price went down at the same time that disease, the witch broom disease, start to appear in the cocoa farms in the state of Bahia. So there, it was a perfect storm for the farmers. For simple reason, cocoa, the witch broom disease, it was endemic from the Amazon, and nobody couldn't understand how that disease appeared in the state of Bahia that was more than 3,000 miles from that place. So many theories appeared. We were interested to understand how the farmers were responding to this crisis. So we got this grant from Conservation International to interview farmers and try to figure out what they were doing. And what we saw was a big change. The cocoa, it was basically a tradition in the state of Bahia, especially in the southern part of the state, and very conservative area. And the farmers, they completely changed land use now. So we start to see farmers selling, farms that they had for more than 100 years, selling to pay the debt that the disease and the price were causing to them. So we start to see they cutting the whole plantation, cutting the big trees, and putting grassland. In some place we saw coffee, in some place we saw coconut. So it was very interesting to see that, how they would change the perception. They said that they couldn't support, what the disease was doing. They had in the area research center that was specifically for cocoa, but with all the economic crisis, the center could do much to help them. So now it's different. So after 30 years, we start to see that they got injection of money. They develop new varieties that are more resistant to disease, and you start to see the cocoa come back. But what was done was done. So they lost many areas of forest that were very protected by the cocoa farm for the cabruca system. That's what they call that when they clean underneath the big trees, they plant cacao. So that was the study, to understand the farmland use disease, how that was changed, the land use land in the region.
Is there any resistance amongst any people or groups to the approach that you're using, or the works that you're doing, or is it pretty well generally seen as a good thing?
Oh no, depends where you are in the country.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So if you are in the Atlantic forest, we don't have much forest there. Mm-hmm. So there are a huge interest in protect that. There are endemic animals there. There are the golden monkey, the Mico leão dourado. It's a small monkey with the face is completely, the body is almost gold. And there is another one that's the face is gold and the body is black. So these are endemic for the area. So people like when you do this type of, but you cannot say the same when you go to the Amazon. When you go to the Amazon, do this type of work, you got to make sure that you are well connected with people that work there, especially farmers. We don't go and just start to do your work. We contact all these, association, cooperatives, make sure that people understand well your work. If not, you can get in trouble. I'm going to give an example. It was in 1997. I think I was with a professor from Michigan State. And we are trying to identify logging areas in the Amazon, use remote sensors. So the idea was to go to the field, collect some points, some polygons using GIS and use that to help us to validate the classification of the image. We got lost, in the jungle going around, and we decided to stop and get some points, put in a map to see where we were there. Well, we saw that two guys came in a horse with, rifles and guns and asked us what we are doing there. So, we had to explain what we were doing, and the guy asked, "What's this gringo is doing here?" So I asked what my colleague was with me, and we had to explain it. We had to give names, say, "Well, we work with these, and we know these people here," and say, "Yeah, but okay, but next time, don't come to this side." Now, and we couldn't understand when we were driving, because there are so many logging roads inside the forest. When we were driving, we saw that this group, actually, they were doing illegal logging there. So depends where you are. You're gonna see, these type of things happening. So it's interesting work, but it's a little bit dangerous if you are not prepared. To work with these people. So that's what I tell my colleagues. They never go to this place alone. Never go without contact people, talk to people. Let's do the basic work first before we can go to the field. People don't have any idea how much danger it is to work in some parts of the Amazon. A lot of gold mining, illegal gold mining. You can, work, be driving around and suddenly you get in a place that nobody knew. We have these big people villages or whatever you want to call. With these all kind of people there working, logging, mining, it's kind of dangerous. So
it brings to mind what you recently got a seed grant through the Global Food Systems here, and part of the topic is assessing rural perception of land management. What you just described is kind of scary. I mean, and there are a lot of things. What have you learned there that relates to the work that you're doing here, or are they just totally different landscapes that really don't overlap with one another?
Yeah, they are a completely different landscape for many reasons. One of the things that we see here we are in an area that is very well developed now. People are very well informed in terms of the management of the landscape. For instance, we are looking at fire, conservation reserve programs. So people know how to manage the fire. What happens here is that sometimes the fire gets out of control because of the wind, and that can affect the perception of some farmers around. Say, well, this is going to affect me. I'm going to just, do this type of things to avoid this fire coming to my property. Now, they are very, very informed. They are the owners of the land. Now, going to places in Brazil, like in the Amazon, there are a lot of public land, and people are grabbing land. Imagine Oklahoma, Kansas in the beginning, where people would come here to grab land. That's what happened in the Amazon right now. There is a law in Brazil that say that if you use the land for 5 years in one day, you are the owner of the land. So that's kind of thing that people do in the Amazon. People don't want you to go around and start asking questions about what you are doing. It's kind of dangerous if you go to the middle of the jungle, start to do this type of thing. It's kind of compared to what we see here. It's a jungle there, and here it's completely developed. Now, if you go to the savanna area in Brazil, in the middle of the country, where the agribusiness in general are working, it's completely different. They're going to treat you the same way they treat you. So enforcing is works. Governance works. Not completely like here, but works. They're not going to kill you like in the Amazon. So that's the big difference that I see. People don't like to talk about this, but this is the reality. If you look at the 1980s, we had a bunch of kills that were noticing, it were highlights in many newspapers all the world, environmentalists being killed in the Amazon. So, I think that there are some places that we can see that it's similar, but places that are completely opposed.
I see part of the activities that you head up at K-State include coordinating and collaborating initiatives to do research internationally. Can you explain a little bit what that brings to the state of Kansas? What is the importance of that kind of international collaboration? And, what's the value to the food system within the United States and certainly within the state of Kansas?
Yeah, that's, I think one of the things that my position is trying to do is to create more opportunity for faculty to work in problems that don't have boundaries. Well, let me give you an example here. We produce soybeans in the United States. Brazil also produces soybeans. Now, which kind of problem both countries are facing that could be solved and benefit both countries? So the idea is to develop collaboration, help more facts to develop collaboration that are going to help both countries. For instance, we have a disease in soybeans in Brazil that we don't have in the United States. How develop a collaboration with them can help us to stay one step ahead. Now look at the problem of the witch bloom that happened in the state of Bahia, Brazil. If Brazil had been working with others, maybe they wouldn't be suffering what they suffered because of the disease. So the idea of this is which kind of collaboration would benefit us and others. Of course, there are some people with more interest in doing local, regional, state work than international work. But there are also people that would like to do a little bit more international work because they can benefit from injection of funds in some regions. For instance, now we have a lot of interest in helping African countries. So there are funds available for people that want to work. But we need to know which countries. So it's very important to see what are the problems. And my office can help them to learn about that opportunity to that country and connect people from that country with people from here and develop this type of proposal that can benefit both countries. That's the idea of this office.
Would you say that the problems that you're addressing in all of this work, are they, do you think of them as like people problems, or do you think of them as, economic problems, or is something else?
I think there are both. I think, for instance, global warming, so that's a society problem, that we need to face. And there are problems that we created. For instance, bad management of your soil in your farm. If you are not aware, if you don't know how to do it, you're going to just increase the problem. I think that the thing is that separate these problems. What are the problems that we create? What are the problems that is the government that creates? What's the problem that society in general creates? If you look at the case of Brazil, what's known as big problem there, inequality. There are 1% of the population is very, very rich, and there is a middle class in the middle that's not too big, and the majority of the population is poor. So it's a problem that the government creates, that society creates there. So it depends on what you are analyzing, and you can separate these problems.
When you look at like any of these things that you've described, and going back to maybe the cocoa production in Brazil, and there was a disease was one major factor here, right? So the price in general was another factor. Like for a problem like that, how do you think about like the different stakeholders and how do you go about addressing sort of the challenges that you've got, right? Is this work where you're talking and interviewing lots of different people? Are you looking, more at the systems point of view? Where do you intervene, and what do you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I try to do, I try to connect the different scales. I try to look at the local scale, the farmer. What are the problems he's facing, and try to connect this to a large scale, like a regional scale or national scale or a global scale. Meaning for the problems that you face at a local scale, where sometimes developed at a much big, large scale. And it was a national policy that was created to prevent some things to happen. And that's affecting different farmers in different ways. So the idea is to interview, my work, interview this farmer and trying to see their perspective, how they feel about that, what's going on with him, and try to see where the problems come from. And try to work with policymakers to show, for instance, that policy there, instead of helping, is create much more problem for maybe a part of the population that they didn't consider. And how to change that, or how to create other policies that can benefit the majority of the population, not just specific groups. That could be benefit from that policy, and so on. So it's my work is it works at the different scales. Try to understand that I go a lot for the field. I do field work, interview farmers, landless people, policymakers, and try to understand how the system works. What can be done, to adjust and create policy to benefit society.
How often is it that there are groups of people that have just been entirely overlooked in the policy decisions that are made? And how often are you actually finding, well, look, we know who the stakeholders are, but we just didn't know what they wanted. And when we do this field work, we discover new things about them. Or are you also pointing out, new pockets of people and stakeholders and that should have been included in part of the process and weren't?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's very important doing this type of field work, is to look at groups and things that you couldn't see it. I'd like to use some examples of Brazil. People can compare, with the United States. And here in the United States, we see, that business industry here, it's very well organized in doing pressure in the government for their own interest. This is very different in South America and Latin America in general. Some places like Brazil, the agribusiness, for instance, is very strong. They have a strong business, and they have a very well organized to pressure the government. But if you look at the other part of the society, like small farmers, that they don't have all the support, they live from subsistence and just produce to eat. They don't have this lobby. And many of the policies that are developed, it's going to focus on one part of the supply chain, in general commodities, and forgets from the other part that the people that produce just to subsistence to survive. And that's one of the things. So the idea is to look at these different agents in the supply chain and see how these policies are affecting the different agents.
So in many ways, the farming system in the U.S. it's changed over time a lot recently, right? But we understand sort of all the parts in some ways, and it may be less the case that where there's less overall organization, or like you said, the different lobbying partners are not as well developed and not as well established, and it hasn't hit everybody. Are there still missing pieces though here in the U.S. of voices in the food systems that are just sort of not being represented, do you think?
I think they are very well represented. They are not too strong. That's the big difference for me. They are represented, different from Brazil, what they are. Some pieces are not represented, are not part of the analysis. Here they are part of the analysis, although they are not too strong. That's one of the big differences that I see. If you look at, if I ask you, what is the agricultural frontier in the United States? people are going to tell me, we don't have it, right? So by saying that we don't have it, we say, well, we are using everything that we have. We know everything that's going on, and so on. But if you look at countries like Brazil or countries in Africa where the agriculture frontier is still moving, there are a bunch of pieces that you are learning when you move to these frontiers. Sometimes people make the mistake, in my perception, say, well, but we don't have agricultural frontiers anymore. And so no, we do. There are places in the Amazon, places in Africa that nobody's living there. Just in the case of Brazil, some indigenous people there. So agricultural frontier in Brazil is still moving. And there are a bunch of pieces that we don't understand how that works. Let me give you an example here. That I see. For instance, if you look at scientific papers, research have been done in the last 10 years about land cover change in the Amazon. You're going to see that people blame the agribusiness for what's going on in terms of deforestation, fire, and so on. Well, but when you look at how they interpret agribusiness, in fact, they are talking about large farmers. They are classifying agribusiness by the type of the crop, if it's a commodity, by the size of the farm, by how intensive is the use of inputs in that. And to facilitate the analysis, they call agribusiness. However, the classical definition of agribusiness is the whole agency, from pre-farm gate, the production, to the table for the, like you say, from the field to the fork. But it's not that the definition that they apply when they are doing the analysis. So, and why? Now, what's missing there? Now, all models, so far, they cannot capture this big definition of agribusiness from pre-farm gate to post-farm gate. And we always consider agribusiness exogenous variables in modeling. So, but in fact, it's very endogenous because in frontier areas, when you are buy a chainsaw, when you are buy seeds to put grass, the agribusiness there work with you, and how you can count for that in the modeling. So there are a lot of things that we are trying to understand now in this process of development. And that here we are much now in front because this is happening now, 1800s, 1900s. And that is happening, still happening now.
Can you give us any specifics on the impact that you have had directly on policy and governance related to these activities? I may have missed something that you said prior to, but are there any specific detail or specific activities that you can point to that were impacted?
I think that as a professor, one of my main goal was to call attention for problems, helping advance the literature in my field, that's land use and land cover change, or land use science. I think that the literature for land use science talks a lot about drivers of land cover change. And one of the evidence that we had, it's not just me, but the group that I have been working with for many years, it was trying to show new drivers of land cover change that people couldn't, we didn't have in the literature. For instance, I have a colleague, I'm a co-author for him in one paper that talks about contention land cover change. And before, nobody could understand what was contention land cover change. And the idea was to show that fight for land, in the Amazon was leading to deforestation. And one of these, it was a consequence of the Brazilian law, the constitution that was not pay attention for these details. Let me give you an example of that. Now, in the presidency of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, he was a leftist president in Brazil. He was supporting social movement organizations for land reforms. And these organizations, they were occupying large properties in many parts of the country, especially in the Amazon. Now, in the Amazon, we had large farmers. When I say large farmers, they are big. Now, they are 30,000 hectares, 60,000 acres. And it's very difficult to monitor, on the field, a large property like that. So social movement organizations were occupying this land, and try to force the government to disappropriate the property and transform the property in small farm for them. So we start to look at satellite imaging, and we start to see different patterns in the landscape. And we decided to write a grant for National Science Foundation. We got some grant to look at different patterns in the landscape. Now, see how land reform settlements are affect land cover change. One of the things that we learned with this proposal was that because of the law that say that if you work in a land for 5 years in a day, you get the right to the land. And the government has the ability to disappropriate your land and give it to others. We start to see that these movements occupy, this part of the land, this property, large property, and the owner to protect the land. They will create militias, to monitor the land. So we start to see a lot of crime in some locations in the Amazon. And at the same time, we start to see a lot of deforestation. Well, people ask, how come the deforestation? The land reform, they create encampments inside the property and they will deforest to produce food for subsistence. And the owner of the property, because a lot of the properties, were for land speculation, when they saw that they would lose the land, what they did was to log the land, clean the land, put a grassland, and wait for the government to disappropriate and pay the value of all the infrastructure that he developed, the farms had developed in the land. So with that, we start to see this contention being a factor in land cover change. So that's one of the big advances, showing that the way that this contention can lead to land cover change in the Amazon. Another one was separate, this type of movement from spontaneous settlements. Let me give you an idea what that means. There are two types of settlements for land reform in the Amazon. One that is a consequence of social movement organizations. They occupy the land. So look here, I'm using the term occupy the land because that's the perception of the landless people that want the land. They are occupying the land. But if you ask the owner of the farm, they say, no, they are not occupied. They are invading my property. So it's a very interesting, definitions that you need to work, talk to these people in there. In the case of the Amazon, when the Brazilian government was opening the Trans-Amazon Highway, bring people without land to land without people, what they did was to develop settlements. In the 1970s, for these people, the government gave 100 hectares for families, 300 hectares to 500 for people that want to create a little business and develop with more, more advanced agriculture. Well, after 40 years, the kids of that families that moved to the Amazon, they became adults. They start to look for their own land to create the farm. 100 hectares. Now, this is a small piece of land, to be honest, in the Amazon for a family, especially because of the soil that's not so good and so on. So these people start to move deeper in the forest to create their own settlements. Now, no social movement organization was behind it. It was just what they call the life cycle of the household. Now, they start to open trails in the forest, mark their own land, and use for 5 years. After they have enough people, around them, they decide to go to the government and say, hey, we have these 30 people living here. We're living here for 10, 15 years. So we need this from you. We need to legalize, we need the title of the land so we can get credit, and so to improve the farm. It is completely different. The similarities in terms of the deforestation that they did, in the end, the land was deforested like in the social movement organization. So the government didn't know that. And we have to show in the literature and talk to policymakers to see how they can help these people so not increase the deforestation. So this is one of the consequences of the work.
What are the different ways that you can make your research and the results aware? I know as a faculty person, I publish in scholarly journals. Are there additional ways that you need to get that information out to different groups? Yeah. When you work in places like that, you need to make sure that you have a broad impact. The idea is to pass the information, not just to the government, but also for the farmers. Developing workshops, develop talks, where you're going to educate them about the problems that they are facing. Policymakers, in case of Brazil, they are in Brasilia, the capital, or in the capital of the city in the state. And we have connections. You need to develop this connection with people so that you can present reports, you can make your case to show why this needs to change. Sometimes you need to work with non-social, non-governmental organization to present report to them because they have a large audience and so on. So I think there are many different ways to do that. Depends on what you want. If you want to create too much fuzz, sometimes going to the newspaper is a good one. If you want to call attention for it. Sometimes you just want to work with the policymakers directly, in the state, and show them the importance of that and let them fight for that thing for you. It depends on what you are looking for, how important is that thing in your perspective for that society in particular. The most important thing is, for me, it's not to be afraid to show what you are doing and how important that for society. Great, thanks.
So the work you're doing with Dr. Jocelyn out of geography and Dr. Bergtold out of econ on the title of this is Agricultural Food Production and Conservation Reserve Programs in the Context of Wildfire. Can you explain a bit about that particular project and if there are things that you've just discussed that tie into this, or how does this project play out in the overall perception of what you're working on today?
Yeah, it's a good question. Here we are looking at the perception of the farmers for fire. Now, trying to understand how they perceive the danger of fire in their property, how that can affect food system. And values, norms, beliefs are very important ways to look at this. Now, how much I value, conservation in my property. Now, this is a topic that is very difficult because it's the way how to measure this. I'm a modeler, how to measure these things in the models. And that's the most important things that we're trying to figure out. How to look at the values, how to look at perception, how to look at norms, how this is important for a farmer, that's producing to make money. That's here in the U.S. We start to see people associate in some locations fires to conservation. This guy was responsible for this big fire here. He doesn't take care of this ECRP, and that's why I don't have any here, in my property because I don't want to take the risk of, fire that come to my property here. That's one of the things that I think that my work has theoretical components, trying to understand, at the same time, try to develop, ways to create policy, understand how to influence policymakers for change in that thing. So this is a work that is still in the beginning. We had the first data collection, but because of the COVID, we couldn't move much because some students tabulate the data for us, and they had left. Was when you finish the collection of the data. It was in March of this year, and we are slowly going back to that. The idea is to create much larger proposal to submit for some fund agents to try to understand the influence of fire and the perceptions of the farmers and land use in the U.S. Yeah.
Yes, I recall I don't know if this is what prompted this particular study, but there was just an absolutely devastating wildfire in the southern central portion of Kansas.
Yeah, not just in Kansas. We, after we start to look at this, we start to see, in many different locations that goes from Nebraska all the way down to Texas. So wildfires, so fires that became wildfires, and sometimes with lack of management. And the idea is try to figure out the perception of the farmers, how this is going to affect, for instance, CRPs in the United States. And it affects conservation and so on. Yeah, I think that's it's interesting. It would be great maybe in the future to have instead just one, but another one speaker with a little more expertise in the West to do a kind of comparison. Like I'm not an expert in the United States. My work is in land use, land change in Latin America and tropical countries. And it sometimes is difficult to do the comparison with the United States because it's not my field. But I see that's important as an environment economist because that's where changes are occurring in terms of natural resources. So if you look at Brazil, 4% of the GDP in Brazil come from the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector in, I think it's 2018, inject $350 billion in the Brazilian economy. So, it's 10% of the labor force works in that field, and because I was born there, I have interest to understand this process, how this affects the use of resources, especially if you look at climate change, how this change can affect society in general. So, and maybe another person from the West would have a different perspective, and look at as a competitor in soy production. Like U.S. is the biggest soy producer. Brazil is the second one. They compete in that. But there are the other things that they complement each other. So that would make maybe this a little bit more interesting for the larger audience.
Yeah, it'd be interesting sometime.
So it was a pleasure to talk to you guys. I hope that I have answered your questions.
You have.
And I hope this is interesting for people, learn a little bit more what I do and why this is important, my perspective.
If you have any questions or comments you would like to share, check out our website at ksu.edu/research/global food and drop us an email. Our music was adapted from Wayne Gowen's album, Chronicles of Carmela. Special thanks to him for providing that to us. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.